He has traveled the world, living and working in more than 40 countries for nearly a decade. He's run companies in 5 countries, which has got to be a record. Jumped out of airplanes at 15,000 feet, and I asked him why at dinner. Scuba dived in deep waters worldwide, trekked to Mount Everest base camp, and walked the plains and forests of Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for best-selling author James Bradley.
So there's my dad in the middle of the most reproduced photo in the history of photography. He's not the guy putting the pole in the ground. He's the next guy up, kind of in the middle. That's John Bradley, and I'm James Bradley. That's my dad. Now, if I stop right now and say goodbye, I'm going to Bourbon Street, you know everything I knew about my dad in that photo growing up with the guy, because he would never talk about it. He would always change the subject. After my dad died in 1994, I telephoned my mom, and I said, "Mom, my telephone headsets are on, my fingers are at my computer. I'd like to take down everything Dad told you about the Iwo Jima flag raising." She said, "Well, this won't take very long, because he only talked about it once, on our first date, for 7 or 8 disinterested minutes, and never again in a 47-year marriage did he say the words Iwo Jima." It wasn't until after my dad's funeral that my brother Mark was searching for my father's will in my dad's office space. Mark opened a closet door, and in that closet we were surprised to find 3 cardboard boxes stuffed with Iwo Jima memories. At the bottom of one box was a letter that my father had written home from Mount Suribachi 3 days after the flag raising. It was a letter to his mom and dad in Appleton, Wisconsin. He was 22 years old. In that letter he wrote, "I had a little to do with raising the American flag, and it was the happiest moment of my life." I cried when I read that letter, wondering why my dad had been unable to share that happy moment with me, a son. So I went on a quest, and I began to read about Iwo Jima, and I learned a lot. I learned that Iwo Jima is a trivial scab far out in the Pacific. It's only 5 miles long. If you're out here on the highways, you can conquer 5 miles in just 5 minutes. We sent out 110,000 American service people. It took them 36 days of hard fighting to conquer that 5 miles. Iwo Jima today is still the worst battle in the history of the United States Marine Corps, and it's probably always going to be that way. I mean, get this. 70 days before the battle, the Air Force came in and started dropping bombs 70 days in a row, making it the single most bombed spot in the entire Pacific War. 3 days before the invasion, the Navy came in and started lobbing shells the weight of Volkswagens against the island. The idea was that they were going to obliterate everything and everyone on Iwo Jima. And it was a great strategy, except for one problem. There was nobody on Iwo Jima. The Japanese were not on Iwo Jima, they were in Iwo Jima. They were underground. And people say, "Oh yeah, they were dug in like the Germans at Normandy." No. If you've ever been to Toronto, there's a fault city underneath the ground. There's bank buildings above ground, and there's dry cleaners underground. You can lead your life in Toronto. Same with Iwo Jima. 22,000 Japanese underground. 1,500 different rooms connected by 16 miles of tunnels on a 5-mile long island. The commander of the Iwo Jima garrison, General Kuribayashi, fought the battle from his command post 75 feet underground. I interviewed Marines who never saw a live Japanese soldier above ground. An American surgeon got tired during the battle. He fell asleep on his tarpaulin. He heard Japanese voices. He looked around, couldn't see anybody. And then he looked down and he pulled up the tarpaulin that he was sleeping on, and to his horror, realized he was atop a Japanese conference room where they were having a meeting. So how was this impossible battle against an unseen enemy won? But I'd like to give you one statistic. You know, in 2006, it seems we have a lot of current heroes. You know, you change somebody's flat tire out on the highway and your Time Magazine's Hero of the Month, it seems. But if you go through all the months of American history, you'll find that there's one thing that we keep pretty good track of, and that's American valor. And if you look through all those months of American history, you will find that there's only one month that is our most decorated. There's only one month where we stamped out more medals for bravery than any other month in the history of the United States. And it's the month that these Marines fought Iwo Jima. And that's what it took. Guys like Woody Williams right here, who won the Medal of Honor, more medals of honor. More medals of honor in Iwo Jima than any other moment in American history. And then there's the photo. When this photo appeared on the front page of all our newspapers, it created an immediate sensation, something like a Beatlemania. People didn't know exactly what it meant, but they fell in love with the photo. Mrs. Sweeney, a good Catholic lady up in Boston, only allowed 2 images on her living room wall, Jesus and FDR. Not even her own kids could get their mugs up on that living room wall. Until she saw this photo in the Boston Globe, immediately cut it out and framed it, put it up on that wall as the 3rd sacred icon. The photo created such a jingle-jangle in the American populace that the president ordered the flag raisers to come back to the Oval Office immediately. Now you can see 4 flag raisers in the front row there. There's 2 in the back row hidden for a total of 6. 3 of those boys died on Iwo Jima. 3, including my dad, made it back to the Oval Office. 9/15, Harry Truman welcomed the new heroes back to Washington. And he said, boys, you fought for a mountain out there in the Pacific. Now I want you to fight for a mountain of cash right here in the United States. And if you see the Clint Eastwood movie, this is mostly what it's about, the 7th Bond Tour. You see, today, President Bush can take our tax money and go fight wherever with the military. Back in World War I and World War II, they were financed by bond tours. We had to go across the country and with like big Rolling Stone type of stadium tours to appeal to the American populace to buy bonds from the government to fund the war. We had a national budget, but we had a war budget, and you couldn't commingle the funds. Harry Truman said to my dad and these 2 other guys, basically teenagers, I want you to go out and in 2 months, 33 cities, I want you to raise $14 billion. $14 billion would have represented 25% of the total United States federal budget that year, an incredible sum. When the government put the boys out on the road, they were shocked at the response. In Boston, 200,000 people stood on the street corners in a sleet storm just to get a glimpse of the boys they would buy in a Jeep. In Houston over here, the Houston police had to barricade the city. They had to put roadblocks around the town. So many people, so many cars were going into Houston to see these boys, the police were afraid they would gridlock the town. You're all familiar with that Martin Luther King 1963 I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial that famous picture of him? You know that sea of people in front of Martin Luther King? The Washington Park Police estimated that 150,000 people showed up to hear Martin Luther King that day. 150,000. When my dad stood at the Lincoln Memorial, 350,000 people showed up. So how did they do? Well, they didn't raise the $14 billion. They raised $26 billion in 2 months, an incredible 47% of the total United States federal budget that year. Folks, this is the most successful product ever sold in the United States to date. Bill Gates and General Motors have never sold $26 billion of anything in 2 months. There's a statue to this photo in almost every state in the Union. Everyone's excited about the Clint Eastwood movie, Flags of Our Fathers. That's the 4th Hollywood movie about this picture. And of course, the first was Sands of Iwo Jima, and who else but John Wayne could win such a battle, you know? And to give you an idea of what Iwo Jima meant to John Wayne's career, just go out to Grauman's Chinese Theater out in Hollywood. You can walk along that Walk of Fame. You can see Betty Grable's handprints here and Madonna's footprints. And when you get to John Wayne's plaque, you'll notice that his is different than all the others. John Wayne's plaque is black because our #1 movie idol asked for the honor of being memorialized in black cement made from black sand, from the black sands of Iwo Jima. But folks, I hate to tell you, you didn't have to come to this dinner to hear me tell you everything I just told you so far, because this is what I was finding in the history books as I began my search after my dad died. I could find all these facts, but I couldn't find what I really wanted to know, and that was, who was my dad on that February 23rd, 1945? Their names are in the encyclopedias, but I wondered, you know, my dad hadn't given interviews, and I wondered, did he know these guys? Were they buddies? Was this a happenstance moment? Had they rehearsed it? What was going on? All the flag raisers were dead, and I was a son without the answers. So I did the only thing I could do. I picked up the telephone, and I called sheriff's departments and mayor's offices all across the United States searching for the relatives of these guys. A brother or sister would pick up the phone. My heart would be in my throat because I thought they were going to shut me out like they had shut out the press for half a century. But they saw me as a family member, and they told me stories that had never left the family circle, and they gave me documents that had never left the family homes. And the result is this book, Flags of Our Fathers, about 6 nice young boys that I'd like to introduce to you now. So there's my dad. He's kind of in the middle of the photo. There's a guy putting the pole in the ground to your far right. My dad's kind of in the middle. Look at my father's helmet. You can see he's obscuring someone. There's a helmet right at my dad's nose there almost. That's the helmet of Rene Gagnon from Manchester, New Hampshire. If you took Rene's helmet off the moment that photo was taken and reached inside that helmet, you'd come out with a photograph. It was a photograph of Rene's girlfriend. Rene stuffed it in there because Rene felt he needed protection. Rene was scared. Rene was 19 years old. Boys won the Battle of Iwo Jima. There's another guy in the back row that you can't see at all. He's totally obscured. I ask you to use your imagination. He's worth it. He's my hero, Mike Strang. Mike's in the back there. You can't see Mike's body, but if you study a blow-up with a photo, or if you go to the memorial, the Marine Corps Memorial in Arlington, take a look at the position of Mike's 2 hands. If you study Mike's 2 hands, you get an idea of what type of guy Mike Strang was. You see, Mike was the leader. He was the sergeant. Sergeant Mike, they called him. They also called him the old man because he was pretty advanced in age. He was already 24 years old. Maybe Mike didn't have to be on that mountain that day. Three months before the Battle of Iwo Jima, Mike's captain tried to give Mike a promotion. Mike turned it down flat. Why? His captain asked. Mike answered, I promised my boys I would be there for them. If you look at the position of Mike's hands, Mike's left hand is on the pole. Mike's right hand is not. Mike's right hand comes through the tangle of bodies and is around the wrist of a younger boy. And that's Mike's strength, that great Marine leader, helping a younger boy in that critical chain of command. Mike's strength was there for his boys to the end. Mike died on Iwo Jima as he was leaning over, drawing a diagram in the sand for the safest way for his boys to attack a dangerous position. The guy furthest to your left, the guy whose hands do not reach the pole, that's Ira Hayes, a dignified Pima Indian from Arizona. Ira Hayes walked off that island of agony and was surprised to be called a hero back in the United States. President Truman called Ira a hero to his face in front of my dad in the Oval Office. Ira didn't see it that way. As Ira later said to the press, how can I feel like a hero when 250 of my buddies hit the beach with me and only 27 of us walked off alive? If you read the words of Ira Hayes 60 years later, you realize you're reading the words of a classic post-traumatic stress syndrome sufferer. But back in the late 1940s and early 50s, we didn't know how to pronounce big concepts like that. And Ira Hayes suffered alone with images of horror in his head, images of his buddies dying on Iwo Jima. 1 year before Ira died, he gave an interview to Time magazine. In that interview, Ira said, I feel like I'm about to crack up, thinking about those guys who didn't come back. My buddies, those guys who were better than me. Ira Hayes died at the age of 33, face down, dead drunk. After Ira died, Johnny Cash had a hit song, and this is how the chorus went. Calling drunken Ira Hayes, he doesn't come here anymore. Not that whiskey-drinking Indian, nor the Marine who went to war. So that's Ira. Last guy to your left. The next guy in, right in front of Ira, in between my dad and Ira Hayes, that's Franklin Sousley, a fun-loving hillbilly from Hilltop, Kentucky. Franklin Sousley was fatherless at the age of 9. His mother had a big tobacco farm down there in Kentucky to take care of. Franklin was the oldest boy, and he helped her out all he could. And there grew a special bond between Franklin and his mother, Goldie. Goldie was taken aback one day when Franklin came home and said, Mama, I've enlisted in the United States Marines. There came that sad morning when Franklin had to say goodbye, go off to boot camp. Goldie was crying. Franklin was holding her in his big arms. And then he stepped back and he put his hands on her shoulders and he looked at her and he said, Mama, don't you worry about me, because when I come back, I'll be a hero. Well, Franklin was a good boy. He often wrote letters home from boot camp. In one letter he wrote, Dear Mama, you wrote to me that you were sick. Mama, I want you to stay out of those tobacco fields because you can grow a crop of tobacco any year, but I can never grow another mama like you. 3 days after the flag raising, Franklin did what my dad did. He wrote a letter home. In that letter, he wrote, I had a little to do with, that was what my dad said. Franklin wrote, Look for my photo in the paper because I helped put up a flag. Well, Goldie in Hilltop, Kentucky were elated. Franklin would fulfill his prophecy. He would come back a hero. And it almost worked out that way until 2 days before the end of the battle, Franklin Sousley got one bullet in the back. And 19-year-old Franklin Sousley was buried on Iwo Jima along with 6,824 American boys. There's a story about the telegram that came home to tell Goldie she would never see her oldest boy again. The telegram came to the Hilltop General Store. Goldie didn't have a telephone, so a barefoot boy ran that telegram through the Kentucky hills up to Goldie's farm. The story comes from the neighbors that they could hear Goldie scream all night and into the morning. I did a little more research and I went down to Hilltop, and that's when I realized the neighbors lived a quarter of a mile away. This picture was taken on a Friday, February 23rd, 1945. It appeared in all our newspapers 2 days later on a Sunday, February 25th. On that Sunday morning, in a little Texas town called Weslaco, Texas, there was a young 24-year-old guy home on leave by the name of Ed Block. He was at his mom and dad's house. Ed was the first one up that morning. He walked out onto the porch. He picked up the local newspaper, the Weslaco Mid-Valley News. Ed walked into the living room. He sat down in the easy chair, and he was holding the front page up, looking at the newspaper. And just then his mother, Belle Block, walked in the living room behind him on the way to the kitchen. She was just walking through the living room. She looks at the photo that he's holding up in the newspaper, and she goes closer, and then she puts her finger on that figure putting the pole in the ground, the guy furthest to your right. And she says, "Look at there, Eddie, there's your brother Harlan." Folks, there were no names given in the newspaper. Ed rifled through the newspaper looking for names and explanation. There was none there. Ed looked at his mother and said, "Mama, that's the back of a Marine. We don't even know Harlan's on Iwo Jima. You don't know that's Harlan." Bell slipped the photo from his grasp and said, "That's definitely Harlan. I know my boy." Well, in the confusion of battle, they couldn't figure out who these guys were for about 2 months. There was something big going on called World War II. Finally, after 2 months, they made identification. The article reappeared in the newspapers, and they had headshots of the boys around the picture with arrows pointing to who they were. And they identified the guy at the base of the pole, not as Harlan Block from Texas, but as Hank Hansen from Boston. Now the problem here was that Harlan Block died on Iwo Jima right after Mike Strang. Hank Hansen died in my dad's arms. Neither of these two guys could talk about this event. My dad and the other flag raisers couldn't identify anybody. This was an insignificant event to them at the time. They weren't looking at who was where. They were in a battle. Mr. Block brought the article to his wife saying it was Hank Hansen. She read the article. She looked at her husband and said, "I don't care what the government says. I know my boy." Now, folks, you have to imagine this. The President of the United States, the War Department, the Associated Press, and everybody in America knows that's a boy from Boston, but there's one crazy lady down in Texas who says you're all wrong. Her daughter Maureen came to her crying, saying, "Mama, the neighbors are laughing at us. They're saying you're crazy. That's not Harlan on the photo, Mama. Harlan is dead. You've got to give it up." Belle looked at her daughter and said, "Honey, I changed so many diapers on that boy's butt. I know it's my boy. It wasn't until 2 years after this photo appeared. It wasn't until 1947 that there was a congressional investigation to find out who was at the base of this pole. It was a congressional investigation motivated by a crazy mother down in Texas. There was testimony in the Senate, affidavits in the House, and eventually the United States Congress was able to determine that it was true that Belle did know her boy. So now you have a little idea of what the photo means to the families involved. And I have to tell you, when I began research on my dad's past and on these Iwo Jima flag raisers and on the Battle of Iwo Jima, one thing that struck me was that this is the most heroic event in American history. But I never saw my dad as some hero. My dad was a very quiet, modest businessman up in northern Wisconsin. You know, when you're 17, 18 years old growing up with your dad in the house, you don't see him as a hero, and you're not asking what he did in his past. To give you a flavor of my dad, after my father died in 1994, my mom told me a story that often up in northern Wisconsin where we had a cottage, she would ask my dad to go for a walk out in the woods after dinner. My dad said no. Why, she asked. Because the bears might get me, my dad answered. Yeah, so the hero of Iwo Jima let his wife walk in the woods alone. It's true. And this was the same with so many other Iwo Jima veterans that I was calling. You know, most heroic event in American history, I'm out there looking for the Rambos, for the John Waynes, bigger than life. And all I could find were these humble guys like my dad who kept saying, I didn't really do anything. Medal of Honor winners like Mr. Williams played down their heroism. And I started wondering one night, I remember thinking, well, what did they do? You know, they surveyed the United States and found the most humble, modest guys in the country and sent them to Iwo Jima. I mean, where are these heroes? I was at an Iwo Jima conference once, and Jesse Boatwright, who was in my dad's platoon, he and I were just leaning up against a wall in a hallway waiting for somebody. And after a couple minutes, he looked at me. He knew I was doing research. He had heard the questions I asked. And he said, you know, Bradley, he said, you think we did something special out there in the Pacific. He said, but we were just ordinary guys. Just ordinary guys doing our duty. And then a little later, something happened. My dad's captain on Iwo Jima telephoned my mother, said, condolences, Mrs. Bradley. Mrs. Bradley, are you aware that your husband was awarded the Navy Cross for heroism on Iwo Jima? The Navy Cross is right under the Medal of Honor in terms of an award. And you know what my mom said? She said, what's a Navy Cross? I went down to Washington to research my dad's citation. And on that trip, I sat in the office of Senator John McCain. And I said, Senator McCain, my father's 35 feet tall in bronze in Arlington. He's in every encyclopedia in the country. How is it possible you can keep a Navy Cross secret from your wife, family, and community for half a century? McCain shook his head and looked at me and said, if you were not a son of the man telling me the story, I wouldn't even believe it. After McCain's office, I went out to the Marine Corps Memorial. And I was looking up at those guys, and I looked at the base of the memorial, and many of you know that at the base of that Marine Corps Memorial are etched the words, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. And I thought about my seeking out these Rambos, these guys of uncommon valor, and all the humility that I was hearing in these interviews. And then it occurred to me that I was looking at the wrong end of the equation. That the key here to these Iwo Jima vets and so many veterans of World War II was that they were guys of common virtue. I was searching for the uncommon valor, but the beauty was that these were men of common virtue. Common virtue as little boys in Depression-era America who learned to say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, and open doors for their elders. Boys of common virtue on Iwo Jima who were just fighting for their buddies and came back humble and built the schools and the pools that guys like the next generation, benefited from so much. And I know he wasn't a veteran, but guys like Pat Taylor, who not only have done so much for the youth of this state, but we are still feeling his common virtue generosity even here tonight. So I slept a lot better in my search, and I realized what type of book that I had to write. A book that looked at this photo, not that these guys are uncommon warriors different than us, but the beauty of this is that they are us. Just ordinary guys out there doing their duty. So it's been my privilege, my real privilege over the course of writing 2 books about World War II, to learn from and document these men of common virtue, these ordinary guys, these heroes of World War II. Thank you.